By autumn of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had devolved into a grinding, mud-soaked slog against the borders of the Third Reich itself. The rapid advance across France had stretched supply lines, particularly fuel, to the breaking point. For the pilots of the U.S. 9th Air Force, the sprawling, open battlefields of summer were gone, replaced by the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line. Their mission, flown from muddy, hastily constructed forward airfields in France and Belgium, was no longer just to hunt panzers on open roads, but to systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its homeland. This meant striking the Hornets in their nests, the well-defended, often camouflaged airfields just behind the front. The on-paper matchup seemed decisively in the Americans' favor. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was a titan of the air, a rugged 8-gunned, 2,000-horsepower brawler that could absorb astonishing punishment and carry a bomb load comparable to early medium bombers. To augment this, 9th Tactical Air Command had begun equipping its Thunderbolts with rocket launchers. In theory, this turned the P-47 into a precision surgical tool, able to deliver explosive payloads without the risk of a high-altitude bombing run or the shallow dive of a strafing pass. The Germans, however, saw a different reality. Their airfields were fortresses, ringed with some of the most feared anti-aircraft artillery of the war, from rapid-firing 20mm cannons to the dreaded 88mm flak guns. They had learned to disperse their aircraft in hardened, earth-walled revetments, and could repair cratered runways with ruthless efficiency. The core of the German confidence, however, lay in the Americans' new weapon itself. The initial armament, the 4.5-inch M8 rocket, was a weapon born of expediency, and it showed. Fired from flimsy triple-tube clusters made of plastic or paper, the unguided projectiles had a disheartening tendency to wobble out of their launchers, their trajectories maddeningly unpredictable. For the hardened Luftwaffe ground crews and veteran pilots watching from their blast pens, the initial American rocket attacks were more spectacle than threat. Major John McCready of the 405th Fighter Group held the nose of his P-47, the Juggernaut. Steady in the shallow dive, the gray skies over Aachen, a familiar, oppressive ceiling. Below, the airfield at Y-29 Ash was a picture of Teutonic order, dispersal pens, barracks, and the dark telltale cross of a concrete runway. His target was a line of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters parked in a revetment. The German flak was already walking its way toward his squadron, puffs of greasy black smoke clawing at the air around them. "Tigers! Arm rockets! Targets as assigned," he called over the radio, his voice calm despite the vibration shuddering through his airframe. He centered the Focke-Wulf 190 in his gun sight, leading it just slightly, trying to account for the M8 rocket's abysmal ballistics. At 1,000 yards, he squeezed the trigger. With a series of dull thumps, 6 rockets detached from the crude launchers under his wings. He watched their smoke trails not as straight lines, but as erratic, corkscrewing paths. One veered sharply left, exploding harmlessly in an empty field. 2 more fell short, digging up mud 100 yards from the target. The remaining 3 bracketed the revetment, their explosions looking more like oversized firecrackers than high-explosive ordnance. They kicked up dirt and shredded the camouflage netting, but the fighters remained visibly intact. The P-47 was a sledgehammer, built to smash anything in its path. But the M8 rockets were like trying to drive a nail with a sponge. Back at a German dispersal, a weary mechanic watched the attack, a contemptuous smile on his face. "Amerikanische Feuerwerkskörper," he muttered to a colleague. "American fireworks." Pulling out of his dive, McCready saw the results mirrored across the target area. Plenty of smoke, churned earth, and frayed nerves, but no burning hangars, no shattered aircraft. The German flak, by contrast, was brutally precise. 2 aircraft from his flight were already trailing smoke. As they regrouped to head for home, a cold frustration settled in his gut. They were risking premier pilots and million-dollar aircraft to deliver a weapon the enemy openly mocked. But intelligence reports spoke of a new type of ordnance arriving from the States, something built not of paper, but of steel, something designed for velocity and power, not just to make a bang. The crates arrived at Y-29 on a convoy of mud-caked GMC trucks in late October 1944. Ground crews, accustomed to the lightweight M8 rockets, grunted with effort as they pried open the lids. Inside, nestled in straw, were projectiles that bore little resemblance to the finicky rockets they were replacing. These were 5 inches in diameter, nearly 6 feet long, and brutally simple in their construction. They were solid steel, with a heavy warhead and a powerful motor section. There were no flimsy paper tubes. Instead, the armorers bolted simple, streamlined launch stubs, little more than metal hooks, directly to the P-47's hard points. Major McCready walked the flight line with his maintenance chief, running a gloved hand over the new ordnance. The difference was palpable. The M8s had felt temporary, almost disposable. This new rocket, the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, felt like it had been sheared from battleship armor. "They're calling it the Holy Moses," the chief said, tapping the rocket's casing. "Supposed to have the punch of a 105mm artillery shell. Flies a hell of a lot straighter, too." McCready remained skeptical. He'd heard promises before. On paper, the P-47 could carry 10 of these massive rockets, a staggering increase in firepower. But if they couldn't hit anything, they were just dead weight. The real test would come in the air. The contrast in weaponry was stark. Where the Germans relied on the engineered precision of their flak cannons, the Americans were now doubling down on sheer, overwhelming brute force. The first operational test was not a grand airfield strike, but a targeted interdiction mission. A high-priority reconnaissance flight had spotted a reinforced concrete flak tower near a critical railway junction, a persistent thorn in the side of fighter-bomber operations. It was the perfect hard target to test the HVARs' mettle. McCready led a flight of 4 Thunderbolts, each carrying 6 of the new rockets. The approach was tense. The pilots were flying with an unproven system, and their target was designed specifically to kill them. As the squat concrete tower grew in his gun sight, McCready felt the familiar pressure of the flak, the percussive thumps of explosions rocking his wings. This time, however, there was a grim confidence that had been absent before. "Tiger lead, in hot," he announced, lining up the shot. He pickled the first pair of rockets at 800 yards. There was no wobble, no erratic corkscrew. The HVARs leapt from the launch stubs with a clean, violent kick, their smoke trails pencil straight and fiercely bright. They crossed the distance to the target in just over a second. The impact was not an explosion. It was a cataclysm. A brilliant white flash enveloped the top of the tower, followed an instant later by a massive secondary blast of dark, churning debris. Concrete slabs, rebar, and the flak gun itself were hurled into the air as if from a volcano. "Jesus Christ," a voice crackled over the radio. "Did you see that?" It was a sentiment, not a question. McCready circled the target, his eyes wide. A huge, ragged hole had been punched through the tower's thick wall, from which smoke and fire now billowed. His wingmen followed, their own rockets slamming into the structure with similar, devastating results. Within 30 seconds, the formidable German strongpoint was reduced to a shattered, burning ruin. They had brought artillery precision to the air. As they turned for home, the tactical implications began to sink in. This wasn't just a better rocket. It was a different class of weapon entirely. The German illusion of immunity, born from watching M8 scatter harmlessly across their fields, was about to be violently dispelled. The invisible advantage was now proven, and 9th Tactical Air Command was already drawing up the plans for a decisive demonstration. The mission briefing in early December 1944 had none of the grim uncertainty of the previous months. The target was Fliegerhorst Fritzlar, a major base for the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader II. It was packed with Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, the very fighters that were making life hell for Allied bombers and ground troops. The plan was not to harass or disrupt, but to annihilate. 48 P-47s from the 405th Fighter Group, including McCready's squadron, would descend on the field in a single, overwhelming wave. Each jug was loaded with a full complement of 10 5-inch HVARs. The takeoff was a thunderous spectacle. One by one, the overloaded thunderbolts clawed their way into the frigid winter sky, their wings heavy with nearly 500 high-velocity rockets. This was the culmination of everything they had learned. The raw power of the P-47 airframe was finally matched with a weapon of commensurate destructive force. The Americans now possessed the aerial equivalent of a naval broadside, a capability the Germans had no idea was about to be unleashed. On the ground at Fritzlar, the distant drone of engines was cause for alert, but not panic. The air raid siren began its mournful wail, and ground crews dutifully manned their flak guns. An attack by Yabos, fighter bombers, was a regular occurrence. They expected a strafing run, maybe a few scattered bombs, or another volley of the laughable American rockets that churned up the grass between the taxiways. A veteran Luftwaffe pilot, taking cover in a hardened shelter, lit a cigarette and remarked to a younger comrade, "Let's see what new fireworks they have for us today." He never finished the thought. McCready's squadron came in low and fast from the east, skimming the treetops to stay under the enemy's radar. They rose just enough to acquire their targets and fired. It was not a volley, it was a deluge. In the space of 10 seconds, a wall of over 100 HVARs screamed toward the flight line. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had ever heard, a continuous, terrifying shriek that rose above the roar of the engines, like 1,000 buzzsaws tearing through the sky. The first impacts were not on the grass, but squarely on the parked Focke-Wulf 190s. One rocket slammed into a fighter's engine cowling, and the plane simply disintegrated. Another hit a fuel bowser parked next to a line of aircraft, which erupted in a massive rolling fireball that consumed 3 fighters in an instant. Hardened earth revetments that had shrugged off M8s were obliterated, the blast wave flipping the aircraft within them like toys. The attack was brutally systematic. The first wave of rockets annihilated the parked aircraft. The second wave, fired moments later by the next squadron, struck the hangars, maintenance buildings, and barracks. The corrugated steel walls of the hangars peeled away like tinfoil, revealing the aircraft inside just before they were consumed by explosions. The flak towers that had once seemed so formidable were targeted and smashed, their crews silenced before they could effectively return fire. From his cockpit, pulling up and away from the maelstrom, McCready could only stare in awe. The entire airfield was disappearing under a pall of black smoke, punctuated by the bright orange blossoms of secondary explosions. An ammunition dump went up with a deafening roar that shook his aircraft even at 2,000 feet. The once orderly German base had become a single sprawling bonfire. There was no more laughter, no more mockery. There was only the stunned silence on the American radio frequency, broken by a single awestruck voice. "My God, look at it burn." The harvest of fire was complete. The P-47s returned to Y-29, not with the boisterous celebration of a surprising victory, but with the quiet, grim professionalism of men who had just witnessed the awesome power of a new kind of warfare. The debriefing was a litany of confirmed kills, not in the air, but on the ground. Pilots who once struggled to describe a few craters in the mud now detailed entire flight lines erased, hangars gutted, and fuel dumps burning hours after the attack. Post-attack reconnaissance photos confirmed their reports. Fliegerhorst Fritzlar had been effectively removed from the Luftwaffe's order of battle in a matter of minutes. The HVAR had worked beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. The success at Fritzlar was not an isolated incident. It was a blueprint. Across the Western Front, as HVARs flowed to the fighter groups of the 9th Air Force, the story was repeated. Airfields, railway yards, armored columns, and command posts that had once been difficult, high-risk targets were now systematically dismantled. The laughter of German pilots had been replaced by a pervasive dread. There was no effective defense against a squadron of Thunderbolts appearing at treetop level to saturate a target with the explosive equivalent of an artillery barrage. The German High Command could design advanced jet fighters like the Messerschmitt 262, but they couldn't make them immune to a 5-inch rocket while they sat helpless on the ground. This new capability had a decisive strategic impact during the Battle of the Bulge. When the foul weather that had shielded the German offensive finally broke in late December, the Allied air forces were unleashed. The HVAR-equipped Thunderbolts were at the forefront of this aerial counterattack, not only striking the Panzer spearheads, but, more critically, savaging the supply lines and airfields that supported them. For every German tank destroyed, a fuel truck or locomotive was incinerated miles behind the lines, starving the offensive of its lifeblood. The Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day attack, Operation Bodenplatte, was a direct and final admission of this reality, a gamble to destroy Allied air power on the ground, because they could no longer effectively challenge it in the air or protect themselves from it. By the war's end, American fighters had fired over 1 million HVARs. The weapon had fundamentally changed the calculus of tactical air power. It solidified the P-47 Thunderbolt's legacy, not just as a high-altitude escort, but as arguably the most devastating fighter bomber of the Second World War. The simple, rugged power of the Jug, when paired with the simple, rugged power of the Holy Moses, created a weapon system that was perfectly suited for the brutal, attrition-based fighting on the Western Front. Standing on the flight line weeks later, Major McCready watched his ground crew arming his P-47 for another mission. The sleek, deadly rockets hanging from the wings were now a familiar sight. He recalled the frustration of those early missions, the feeling of impotence as his inaccurate M8s went astray. That frustration was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The Germans had mocked their fireworks, but in doing so, they had failed to see the industrial giant behind the curtain, learning, adapting, and perfecting its tools of war. They had laughed at the spark, never imagining the inferno that was to come.